Did you know that the president of South Africa earns more money than the chancellor of Germany?
I didn't know that.
President Ramaphosa has been a very weak president for the ANC. He's not been able first to control his own party. China every year produces 600,000 engineers. So there's no premium on being a skilled person. In South Africa, there's a huge premium because there are very few of you. Our education system suppresses the production of skilled people. The South African civil service is the highest paid in the world as a percentage of GDP. A few years ago, the South African...
Guys, so one of the things I enjoy a lot about this intellectual, Mbeki, is his ability to really help break down really complex issues into really simple bits so that we can really understand. And I think in this video, he's actually given a blueprint of solutions for South Africa, right? And if probably the ANC could actually adhere to some of what he says, I think it could really be smart. He's speaking about especially a lot because this is also very something I wouldn't necessarily easily imagine is the role of the civil service in relation to the GDP of our country. So we know that the GDP, the gross domestic product, is the amount of goods and services produced within an entity, and it speaks of the kind of the productivity in that land. So in other words, we know that South Africa still tops in a way. South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, I think Kenya, this country is still top in terms of the one of the highest GDPs in I think Morocco also could be added in that highest GDPs on the continent. But the problem now with South Africa then becomes the relationship with the GDP and then service delivery. And one of the things that Mbeki in this video is trying to help us understand is the role of civil service in ratio to GDP. So in other words, he's arguing, right, that of all the goods and services produced in South Africa, right, 16% of that goes into paying salaries for the public sector, what has been called the public sector or the civic sector. And for me, that's really staggering. 60% of the productivity of the land, and actually I'm sure this comes from the taxes of the productivity and the laborers and all of the skills in the land. 16% of all that has to go to paying salaries of all the guys we see in parliament, all the guys we see in the council, leadership of the local government and all of that. And so we see now that the public sector in a state entity really plays a huge role as to how much is available for investment in infrastructure, in education, in hospital, in health and all of that, that can actually help also promulgate better service delivery and all of that. So Mbeki now is actually arguing that South Africa's public service is one of the highest paid in the world. And South Africa is still suffering under a weight of less productivity. We're still struggling about whether China will be able to supplement the aid gap that actually had been created, especially with USAID, the Chinese influx into the industrialization move of South Africa. We see ArcelorMittal. I'm yet to really conclude, understand if they have concluded that they'll be leaving, but South Africa has been suffering from this industrialization. We saw massive industrialization during the apartheid era, but now we're seeing a declining move in industrialization. So the productivity in terms of industrialization and all of that hasn't been sharp. Yet, South Africa still pays as much as 16% in ratio to GDP to paying salaries of the civil service. And so now it makes sense to me why during the time when the elections were over and President Ramaphosa was posting people to post, many people were angry about, the large public sector. There were deputies and all of that. I think even the EFF spoke at some point about why the need for a deputy ministers and something like that. So now it makes sense because, in other words, when you have a large civil service, what Mbeki is arguing is that although 16% of GDP is actually used now to service the salaries of these people, imagine if that 16% could be 6%, because he's arguing that South Africa is along the same developmental pathway like the likes of Chile, the likes of Thailand, you know, some of these countries. And Chile and Thailand, for example, according to his analysis, the civil service compensation in terms of in relation to GDP is only 6%, all right? And the likes of Chile, the likes of Thailand, the Asian tigers are so productive. You know, there's so much productivity going on. Yet, the ratio of their civil service payment, especially the size of the civil service in relation to the GDP is only 6%. So Moletti Mbeki is arguing that imagine if South Africa had that extra 10%. So even though 16% now of South Africa's GDP goes to servicing salaries of the president and all of that, imagine if an extra 10% could go into water, the water crisis in Joburg, for example, could go into infrastructure, could go into health, could go into roads, could go into skills development, high unemployment rate. We see a high unemployment rate. I think I saw a really staggering report that it appears that South Africa's unemployment rate might be getting into the 60%. I mean, I've been juggling about 33% thereabout, but it was a really crazy report, and I'll be going through that again. But imagine if that extra 10% could be divested into investments. You know, what he calls, I think I like the way he calls it. See, he calls it investment ratio in proportion to GDP. It will really go a long way in helping South Africa. So it was really interesting also that he argued that, you know, the president's, the salary of the president in South Africa, maybe some other African countries as well, may be more than the salary of the German chancellor. So in other words, the salaries of the president from what had been called developing states, so to speak, is higher. It makes me laugh, bro. It makes me really laugh. But their salaries are higher than the salaries of the presidents in really highly advanced, industrialized, productive states. And it's just something I'm struggling to understand, but let's quickly listen to Moletti Mbeki lectures on these dilemmas. And also why I like this video with Cizwe for Welch is that he really professed solutions, which both at the personal level and at the government institutional level, we can actually take personal responsibility or institutional responsibility in how to prepare for what is to come in South Africa going forward. So let's quickly listen to Moletti Mbeki, highly intellectual mind, you know, in his analysis of South Africa. And I really admonish you guys to watch this one to the end and share your thoughts, guys. Let's see what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments.
What do you think we need to do to actually grow this economy at the kind of rate that we need to grow it at? I suppose another way of asking that is, what do you think such a party would have to advocate for? Because it does seem to me that we have a lot of ingredients to be a very dynamic economy, even a very dynamic region. And of course, we've been stagnating for, goodness knows how long now. Mm-hmm. So what do you think it is that we need to do? And just finally, to build on what you've said, we do also have this massive inequality and poverty that we need to grapple with. And I appreciate that you are not a big fan of BEE, clearly, or of more direct measures like expropriation without compensation. But then how do we grow the economy while making sure that as we grow, we don't just maintain the patterns of inequality that have already been etched into our economy?
Well, as you say, the inequality in our economy is etched into the economy. It is etched into our history. Why did we get this inequality? We got our inequality in South Africa, if I can put it, by creating artificial scarcity of skills, of skilled people, of professionals, of artisans. That's why we have so much. That's what's at the bottom of the inequality of South Africa. In the 19th century and in the 20th century, there was a creation of scarcity by restricting professions to whites only.
Sure.
So that created an artificial scarcity of skills and of professionals. So their salaries, those who created that artificial scarcity, their salaries shot through the roof because they were scarce. What has happened after democracy, this system has continued. The system of continued artificial scarcity. Our education system hasn't been changed to mass produce skilled people. If anything, if you look at the Asians, Asia mass produces skilled people. That's why Asia is more equal. China every year produces 600,000 engineers. So there's no premium on being a skilled person. In South Africa, there's a huge premium because there are very few of you. Our education system suppresses the production of skilled people. And hence this. So where do we go then? Having said that, where we have to start, which is what a political party controls, we have to start with the civil service. The South African civil service is the highest paid in the world as a percentage of GDP. A few years ago, the South African government invited the International Monetary Fund to come and study the salaries of the public service. And they concluded that the public service in South Africa earns 16% of GDP. Similar countries to us at the level of development, like Chile in South America, Thailand in Asia, is only 6% of GDP goes to public service salaries.
Wow, that's quite staggering.
So it's a huge, huge amount of money that is going to civil service pay.
So everything we produce as a country in a year, 16% of that must go back to
the salaries of the public service.
And then we want to increase tax.
Yes,
to pay for that.
To all that.
In part.
So what we should be doing is to say, take that to cut the civil service pay back to similar countries and take that 10% that we save and put it into investment, into building infrastructure, into building new universities and so on and so forth. That today, our investment as a percentage of GDP is only 15%. If we took that 10% and added, we'll go up to 25%, which will put us where we were when we were building the stadiums in the beginning of 2000.
Yeah, the good old days.
Exactly. That's what it would do for us. So the first obstacle we're sitting with in South Africa is the overpaid public service. But the public service is part of the middle class that controls political power. And the ministers, by the way, are included in this pay. Did you know that the president of South Africa earns more money than the chancellor of Germany?
I didn't know that.
South African economy is a fraction of the size of the German economy. But our president earns more money than the chancellor of Germany.
Not that he needs a lot more money.
Yes, he has other ways of earning. But his pay. So this is an illustration of how the middle class parties are using their power to enrich themselves through taxing the rest of the economy. And that is what is driving our stagnation. Now, if you went to the government of national unity and said, take off 20% of GDP from the salaries, they will all refuse. Because all of them, whether they're DA or ANC, are being paid these phenomenal salaries. The town clerk in Cape Town is earning the same salary as the town clerk in Johannesburg, and these are hugely inflated salaries. The mayor of the DA, the mayor of the ANC, the mayor, who else is there? Got a mayor. They are all being paid this phenomenal salary. So to come back to your question, what should we do to kickstart the South African economy to get it to where it was in 2005? When it was like starting to pick up.
Absolutely.
We have to cut back on this overspending on the salaries of the public service, then that gives us a foundation on which to start building. Because according to the National Development Plan, we should be at 30% of GDP going to investment instead of consumption, which is what these huge salaries do. So that is the short answer to you.
Yeah.
Now, who is going to do it? As long as the middle class control the political power, they will never allow you to do it. Unless you get a Deng Xiaoping who reforms, which we are not getting.
How do you assess what President Cyril Ramaphosa has done as president?
Well, I think President Ramaphosa has been a very weak president for the ANC. He's not been able first to control his own party. He's not really controlling the ANC. He's not controlling his cabinet, which is why, ministers say all sorts of things. Gwede Mantashe says one thing, the government decides we have to do something about green energy. He says no, he's going to keep burning coal, and he's still a minister despite contradicting what the government is saying. So for me, he has been, again, coming back to that word, holding operation. He's been a holding operation. I think he sees himself as weak in the scheme of things. The ANC has its own inner circles. So he feels that he's not part of the inner circle. And so he hasn't got the muscle to enforce the ANC's own decisions, because they have to be enforced. He doesn't feel he's strong enough to insist that decisions must be enforced. And so what you have is a rather hectic, chaotic government, and it becomes even more hectic and chaotic now that it's in partnership with other political parties in the government of national unity. I mean, you can see DA ministers talking about me. As a DA minister, I'm doing X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
But he's part of Mr. Ramaphosa's cabinet. He should be speaking about what the cabinet is doing. But because he feels, well, there's nobody to stop me talking about me representing the DA, so he goes ahead and says, I was listening to one, I think it was public and works person, praising himself about doing this as a DA minister and what have you.